Alright, so my name is Justin Hanley. I'm currently a student at Keiser University. Recording is Jill. Also with me in attendance is Nevada and Caitlin. So this is going to be a presentation on my final capstone project. On my capstone, my topic was drugs should remain illegal in the US. So when we first began researching this and going back, many of us today would probably think there's a long storied history when it comes to drugs in the United States. But that's really not the case. Most of what we think of today with drugs goes back to when the war on drugs started. The war on drugs started in 1971. That was only 50 years ago. If you're looking at the true history of drugs, we can probably go back to the Civil War for the beginning of drugs in the United States. So during the Civil War, that's when we had the really big increase in opiates. So opiates is now what many may know as heroin. So opiates at the time really wasn't for treatment of curing people. Instead, it was more for pain relief. They knew that these soldiers were coming back with injuries, gunshot wounds, what have you, and instead of giving them proper treatment, because of how treatment was back in the 1800s, we went forward and gave them opiates. This got relieved a lot of pain and led to a major addiction. Fast forward to today, 1 in 200 Americans are affected by opiate addiction. During the Civil War, it's estimated that over 10 million opiate pills were distributed out to soldiers and millions of ounces of powder. What really changed a lot was in 1870, and that was the introduction of needles. So once needles were introduced, that's when people were able to inject drugs intravenously. New state laws were created, and that began with the Harrison Act in 1914. So the Harrison Act was what originally regulated opium. That pretty much put a lockdown on opium being given out to soldiers and really citizens at the time. Addicts at the time weren't really thought of as being delinquent as we think of today, as being members that don't really contribute to society. Back then, members of society that were addicted were more wealthy. It was the common American who was more viewed as malpractice than anything. So with the war on drugs, it became really successful when there was a build of a whole bunch of different law enforcement agencies and really began to crack down on drug use inside the United States. But what that led to was overcrowding in the jails. And that's kind of an issue that we got to today, and that was an issue that brought on new laws of how do we fix this overcrowding that we're finding in our jails. So Oregon was the first state to propose a new law that it would make user amount of drugs legal. This is all drugs. Now when we say user amount, it depends what kind of drug you're talking about. If we're talking about marijuana, it could be anything less than 20 grams, methamphetamine less than 14 grams. Depending on what drug it is, all the way down to fentanyl, less than a gram. So for the average person, if you were to go into your kitchen right now and take out a spoon and get some sugar, you'd have about 4 grams of substance on that spoon if we're trying to put it into a size. With this though, we have to realize making drugs legal has a much bigger effect. You have to look at that drugs and crime go hand in hand. And when you look at it going back in history, you have to start with the basis of where the drugs came from. We're talking about the cartels and how the cartels really affected the US and crime. The way we can look at it is going back to the 1980s crack epidemic. During that time period, crack cocaine became extremely popular in the United States and exploded throughout major cities. During that time period, we also saw a giant increase in crime, violent crime. Gangs weren't initially violent. They were more just delinquent groups of juveniles. As drugs got introduced to the United States, these cartels needed people to distribute the drugs, and the gangs were the perfect source. So at that time period, the drugs got distributed out to the gangs who owned territories then began to distribute the drugs within their area. Obviously with this came a lot of money, and that's where you get the violence, people that were trying to control territory. So directly from the cartels down in South and Central America to the cities inside the United States with the gangs, the violent crime erupted in the United States in the 1980s with the crack epidemic. But the federal agencies that were fighting during the war on drugs were taking out many of these cartel leaders. Most famously, a lot of people know about Pablo Escobar, who was at the time in charge of the Colombian cartel that was producing and manufacturing a lot of the cocaine inside South Central America and bringing it through to the United States. Even though most of us can't think about the violent crimes with the cartel and the gangs of the United States, because it doesn't affect most of us, you gotta realize that outside of violent crime, drugs have a direct impact in our neighborhoods when it comes to property crimes. When the drugs get to the drug user, they have to have a way of using their drugs. They use them, and then they have to get more money to buy them. So that makes the drug user then go to neighborhoods throughout the United States and suburbs and outside of the city that are easy access to them and areas of opportunity. That's where you get a lot of burglaries, thefts, thefts from construction sites, copper wire thefts. And these are all easy crimes that can be committed that they can turn into pawn stores, they can turn into their local scrap yards, and they can get easy money. So even though the average American can't relate to that violent crime, they can relate to the property crime that's taking place all over the United States and inside almost every neighborhood. Sadly, we like to think about ourselves when it comes to the use of drugs in the United States and the drug user. And for those that are not addicted or don't have anybody that they know is addicted to drugs, they don't really think about the effect on them. But we do have to take a step back when thinking about legalizing drugs and just how much of an effect it has on the actual drug user as well, outside of the everyday American. Because the drug user is one that's a victim of these new laws. No one wants to become an addict. When you become an addict, it's a process. You may go to a party, accidentally use a substance. You may have an injury that requires you to use pills. And as you use the pills, you become addicted to the pills, no longer get prescribed the pills because of laws, and then you turn to an illegal substance to continue your addiction. With the laws being passed saying that someone can have a user amount of drugs, it doesn't mean that that drug user can just go to the local store and get methamphetamine, get heroin, and get cocaine from the local Rite Aid or Walmart. They're still being produced and brought in by illegal cartels and gangs into the United States. These drug users then become the victims. We're allowing them to use the drugs, but they still have to do a very dangerous act of going out and obtaining these drugs. Outside of that dangerous act, we also have to think about the health side effect of using these drugs. Short term, it can create insomnia, loss of appetite, paranoia, and that's just the short term. When you're talking about long term use of drugs, that's when you start looking into organ damage and liver disease, heart disease. That's when you're looking into the loss of teeth. You can talk about the brittling of bones, the loss of hair, and the most dangerous of all to the drug user, which is the overdose. In 2018, there were 67,000 overdose deaths alone. If we allow these people to legally possess the drugs they're overdosing on, then we're just going to lead to more overdoses. Because now, when they get stopped by law enforcement, or the family tries to intervene, they're not allowed to, because it's legal for these people to possess. Which means that more will use, more will continue to use, and will increase this number from 67,000 to who knows what. Also with the long-term and short-term effects is you have the increase of STDs. During the 1980s crack epidemic, there was a giant influx of syphilis. And doctors were even quoted stating that they thought it was impossible to stop the spread of STDs unless we focused on the drug usage inside the United States. Between 2013 and 2017, the syphilis rate rose 73% in the United States. At that time period, 2013 and 2017, it's also when meth rose in the United States. That's when meth really made a giant comeback and began being used a lot. And showing a direct correlation between the drug usage and the rise of STDs. Another part of the STDs is that once you're underneath the influence of drugs, you may be having unprotected sex, unsafe sex, and sadly sometimes non-consensual sex. 11% of all women in the United States claim they were raped underneath the influence of drugs and or alcohol. During the research, a lot of people thought that maybe there's a stigma that the rapes happen mainly because of alcohol usage. But what you gotta kind of go back and look at is when you're allowing all drugs to be legalized for user possession, That also includes date rape drugs, including ecstasy. So now people are able to legally obtain, well, not legally obtain, but legally possess drugs and use them at bars and nightclubs, concerts, so on and so forth, that can drug women with these date rape drugs. They're legally allowed to use, legally allowed to have them. So that alone would increase. And to put that number in perspective, if 11% sounds small, 11% of women in the United States is 18 million women. So even though we talk about a lot of the physical damage with STDs, organ damage, liver disease, heart disease, the physical damage can be fixed somewhat. Once the drug usage stops, depending on how long someone uses, we can help them with the physical aspect. But the hard part is also the mental aspect that drugs do to somebody and the mental damage. Drug use can lead to numerous mental disorders. This can include anxiety, paranoia, and depression. When someone's consistently using drugs and they have the physical damage on top of the mental damage, if they don't overdose and they don't get everything under control, it could easily lead to suicide. The Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration said suicide was the second leading cause of deaths for individuals 10 to 42 years of age. Drugs were prevalent in 37% of those suicides. Even though the brain does show signs that it heals somewhat once drug usage stops, legalizing these drugs and letting people continue to use will do nothing to help solve the overdose numbers or the suicide numbers inside the United States. For those that don't commit suicide and don't overdose during their drug usage, they still have to deal with what's going to happen with their family and themselves. Most of the time, the family finds out about someone's drug usage because of law enforcement intervention. They get stopped on a traffic stop, drugs are found, most of the time families are shocked. They had no idea about the drug usage in the early stages. Sometimes families find out because they find the drugs inside the home and they call law enforcement to intervene, to get rid of the drugs, destroy them, and talk to somebody about the services available to help them out with their drug usage. By legalizing drugs, you're taking away law enforcement's ability to intervene. You can no longer call and say, my son has a legal amount of drugs, can you come take them? It's legal for them to have it. Law enforcement can no longer help. If law enforcement stops a vehicle and they have that user amount of drugs that's legal, there's no intervention. The family never finds out. So you're stopping the first step of intervention for most of these families. Then that's going to lead them to finding out once the drug user begins stealing and pawning items, jewelry, money, gifts, and eventually it'll lead to alienation. Sadly, for those that have children or are pregnant, once their family stops helping, they still have to deal with their children and infants. In 2016, 220,000 infants were affected by exposure of drugs in the womb. Exposure can lead to multiple disorders and even learning disabilities. If you legalize it, that means that drug use while people are pregnant would technically be legal. From 2012 to 2016, DCF removal, 35% of it was because of drugs. Out of those 35% of the children that were removed by DCF in that time period, 41% were under the age of 5. When DCF intervenes, they have rules for custody. A parent may have to take parenting plans, submit to drug tests, have follow-up appointments. If it's legal for them to possess drugs and use their amount of drugs like we talked about, how many of those kids will remain in foster care because their parents never got clean? Parents never had an initiative. It was legal for them to have it, and DCF is now going to be taking more kids out of homes, and more kids will never return back to their parents because of the new laws. For those that don't have kids, or even do have kids and now they lose their kids, and they no longer have help from family, now they're going to transition to homelessness. The National Coalition for Homelessness stated that drugs were the third leading cause for those that became homeless. People were interviewed and stated that once they were homeless, many of them began using drugs to fit in with the people around them. And once they're homeless, it's not like this is an easy recovery. They're now long down their battle with drugs, and now drugs are still going to be legal for them to use. The legalization just enables that behavior to continue until when someone spirals out of control. For many politicians, I believe legalization is an easy answer. They get faced with jail overcrowding and issues going on with drug users being arrested. And to legalize drugs, you're letting it be an easy answer to get rid of it. Instead, we need to go back to the hard way of doing it, but it's the right way of doing things. We need to ensure that we educate society and help them out. We need to make sure that kids know growing up the dangers of drugs, exactly what it will lead to. When we're talking about the mental aspects of suicide, the physical aspects of overdose, the long-term disease and damage to your body, damage to your brain. Keeping drugs illegal alone stops people from using drugs. With drugs being illegal, well, that alone is incentive. Many know how dangerous drugs are, and they understand it's illegal, and they understand the felonies that are associated with doing and obtaining drugs. That alone stops people from wanting to go down that path, because they understand just how dangerous it is legally to have those drugs in their possession. If you now legalize the possession of drugs, kids who are 18, 19 years old that are going out to clubs, concerts, parties, experimenting, are no longer scared of the repercussions of just simply possessing that drug. So they may hang on to it, they may think about it, and then someday use because it's legal for them to do. On top of that, I think we should create new laws for treatment, make it mandatory for certain individuals when they get out of jail or prison that they seek treatment, whether it's family counseling, mental health counseling, job fairs, and then ensure that we do continuous counseling. I personally think it would be great to almost do a guardian program to where if someone's released from prison and underneath probation, in terms of probation, is that you maybe shorten it by helping out those that are going through stuff that they went through. Someone that's been arrested the first time for drugs and now released can have them as a mentor, and they can be in contact with them to let them know what happens if you continue this path. How many times they've been arrested, what the system was like, how many holidays and family events they missed, and how much they regret going down the path they went down. They help intervene early on. So in conclusion, legalizing drugs is not the answer. You have law enforcement getting murdered trying to fight the people that are making and distributing the drugs. You have mental health professionals fighting to help the mental aspect of those that abuse drugs and are trying to re-enter society. You have agencies like DCF battling to get families back together and have parents clean up so that way they can have their children again. You have so many people in society right now trying to help those that are actually victims of drug use. And if we simply just open the door to legalizing drugs, to let people use drugs, we're pretty much giving up on those that are addicted. We're turning our back and saying, you can have this problem, you can possess those drugs, continue on your life. It's no longer our worry. I don't think we should turn our back on anybody inside society, and instead we should do what we can to help, even if that's the hard road to do. That was the conclusion of my capstone.